The Dorothy who found his yellow brick road. It's Role Model. Welcome to Six Notes for Separation. If you're new to the podcast, here's how it's going to work. Every episode, I dive into an artist, exploring their lives, their music, their careers, and any tumbles they might have taken along the way. But to keep things spicy for you all and to keep you all on your toes, I've put my own little spin on things. Oh, yes, I have. Every episode I do has to be linked to a previous and succeeding artist in some way. This could be through a producer the two artists have in common. This could be through an online feud they might have, a relationship history, a collaboration. Truly anything goes as long as there's a link. So, without further ado, I'm going to dive into the life of who some may know as a boyfriend of an internet it girl, but who others may know for the satirical wit and humour he plasters all over TikTok. Although he wasn't named as the sexiest musician of 2024, Gracie Abrams did crown him as the sexiest man on tour. Of course, I'm going to be exploring the life and career of Role Model. But before we go back to where it all started for Role Model, it's time to reveal the link between this week's and last week's Gracie Abrams. The link between the two is probably quite obvious for some. Role Model opened for Gracie's The Secret of Us tour in September to October of 2024, and he's just been newly announced as an opener for her 2025 dates. But upon doing some research and delving slightly deeper into the history of the two, it turns out that these two artists have a lot more connecting them than a tour which kicked off last year. Gracie and Role Model are both part of what artists love to call the Benny Camp. The Benny Camp is named after producer, songwriter and musician Benny Blanco. He's incredibly talented, a big name behind some of the biggest tracks. And he worked with Gracie Abrams on a song called Unlearn in 2021. Gracie hopped on a collab for him. And he also set up his own record label called Mad Love Records, which has now gone defunct, but more on that later, but which Role Model signed to in 2018. But there's also a more personal link that takes place between Gracie and Role Model, which is that simply they've just been fans of each other for a really long time. Alongside my beloved Billie Eilish, they all started on SoundCloud around the same time. There was a group of artists like Billie, like Gracie, like Role Model, that all broke through on SoundCloud around a similar time. So that's how Role Model and Gracie first kind of, I guess, knew of each other. And in an interview in 2020, Role Model even named Gracie Abrams and McGee as two must-watch artists, both of whom have now blown up in their own right. But that list he gave is one he should have very much included himself on, because come 2024, and Role Model became one of the most talked about male artists, I would say, of the year. Although success is something that seems to find Role Model relatively easy, it wasn't necessarily built into his family like we saw with last episode's Gracie Abrams. Role Model's life began in Maine in 1997, born under the name Tucker Pillsbury. His father was an estate appraiser and his mother a school teacher, so as I mentioned, he lived a pretty average life. Music was never at the forefront of his life at all. It didn't really play a part in his childhood. I think you hear a lot of stories about musicians who, started singing as soon as they could talk and who grew up wanting to be a performer. That was most certainly not the case for Role Model. The one influence that Tucker has mentioned as being significant in his childhood was, of course, the one and only Elvis Presley. He described himself as having an obsession turned borderline crush on Presley. I can relate with Billie. We all can. I think to some extent there's always that one celebrity that you just can't seem to shake, and that was Presley for Tucker. But he recalls making cardboard cutouts of Elvis, even dressing up as him for Halloween, and owning a Presley-themed lunchbox, which I think is just an adorable image. The majority of us went to school with a Disney princess or a Hello Kitty lunchbox, maybe Avengers and Marvel, and I love the fact that Tucker Pillsbury arrives with Elvis Presley. It's just so old school of him. But as I mentioned, that was really the full scope of Tucker's musical exposure. Although always loving poetry classes in high school, music and songwriting wasn't even a career path on his radar. So in 2016, at the age of 19, Tucker moved to Pittsburgh to major in film at Point Park University. And it's here where music enters the chat. The way Tucker stumbled into music was entirely by accident. I mean, the man quite literally tumbled into making music. In his first year of uni, the idea of studying was completely sent out the window when he broke his wrist once on a skiing trip and then again when he was skateboarding. Stuck in his dorm room with the prospect of writing essays completely inaccessible, Tucker was left to his own devices with the music equipment his two friends had left him and told him to experiment with. These two friends made music themselves, so I'm presuming they had some MIDI keyboards or some Logic Pro, pretty student materials, pretty basic things to work with. But as it turned out, that was all Tucker needed in order to become the, dare I say, TikTok sensation we now know as role model. Smoking, drinking, and depressed, Tucker Pillsbury began rapping and making music under the name Tucker. From the get-go, his music was always very confessional and honest, but it took a couple of more name changes until he hit mainstream success, or until he hit at least a grassroots fan base. Uploading his stuff to SoundCloud, as I mentioned, along, in the same time frame as Gracie and Billy, Tucker released his debut mixtape in 2016, followed by his debut album Moth, releasing the record under the name Dillis, a nod to his favourite movie role models. However, with this new focus and hyperfixation on music, it's safe to say that uni work became the least of Tucker's priorities. He watched his grades drop as he continued to plug away at his music, cold calling any venue in Pittsburgh to ask if he could be the opener for any acts they had on. So he was a bit of a hustler. I think you'll see in a minute, but you do have some musicians like Sabrina Carpenter, for example, that's been hustling for years and has only just got her breakthrough. And I think for Tucker, it was a little bit different. He hustled a tiny bit during this kind of 1 to 2 year period at uni, but that was all he needed. And ultimately, it was this ambition and determination that proved to be successful for Tucker, because in 2017, he released the song Cocaine Babe under Role Model onto SoundCloud, shifting from rapping to singing, gaining him his first hit of streams and attention. The name change to Role Model was born out of irony. It was born out of the fact he was anything but a role model at the time. But with the new turn of success, it became evident that Tucker couldn't go back and think a little harder about the name he'd later be known for. It's something he's kind of expressed in interviews, but he's kind of like, I went as role model at the time because I thought it was a bit of a joke, and now I'm stuck as role model for the rest of my music career. So not something he gave a lot of thought to, but despite this grassroots following, role model acquired. Tucker wasn't blind to the fact he was failing school and had no career prospects on the horizon. He put out his EP Arizona in the summer, recording it all in the closet of his room, which again kind of gave him a bit of a following. But he also gave himself an ultimatum. The ultimatum was as follows. After putting out Arizona in the summer, if nothing were to develop in 2 months, if he were to gain no following and no larger success, he'd give up music and reevaluate what to do with his life. A very practical decision, to be honest. A very practical decision. But also actually interestingly, it's interesting, like he gives himself this ultimatum, and I think for some musicians, they would never do such a thing. Like even if they weren't necessarily successful with the music they were putting out, music becomes such a lifeline and such a way of life for them, as cheesy as it sounds. They would never ever consider not. They would just push through the hustling. But for Role Model, it wasn't quite like that, because music was so new in his life. He didn't, it's not like he had 19 years of growing up wanting to be a musician, because it was literally a kind of uni crisis that he was in. It meant giving up music didn't feel like a big sacrifice for him. It was just more of like a shame. If he had to do it, it was more just a bit of an annoyance that he wouldn't know what to do with his life. But guys, something remarkable happened. In that 2-month window, Quentin Cuff, also known as Q, also known as the longtime friend and manager of the late and great Mac Miller, reached out to Tucker, telling him that Mac Miller, or Malcolm if I may, really liked the song Stolen Car on the EP and wanted to fly him out to LA. Now, there are 2 pieces of context here which I think are quite important to add. Number 1, Mac Miller was going through his breakup to Ariana Grande at the time, so he related to the self-reflective and rather depressing nature of Role Model's music. But most importantly, number 2, Mac Miller was born and raised in Pittsburgh, so he always kept a close eye on the music scene there. He always kept an ear to what was going on. But I want to pause for a second, because this story is just fantastic. From giving himself a 2-month ultimatum over when to quit music to being flown out by the brilliance that Mac Miller is known for. I mean, it's so lucky, but it's also, I mean, the closest comparison I have off the top of my head is that of which happened between Ice Spice and Drake. I have an episode on Ice Spice if you want to go check it out, but a similar thing happened right at the beginning of Ice Spice's career, where Drake had a residency with a radio station, heard Ice Spice's music, and that's kind of how Ice Spice blew up, I believe. And then Drake flew Ice Spice out to Toronto. And that's, that shows these kind of huge industry names helping out musicians at the start of their career. And I guess now that I'm thinking about it, actually, it was a similar situation between Rita Ora and Jay-Z. It was the same thing. Like, I think Jay-Z had heard of Rita Ora. She was just, literally, I think a teenager or like barely an adult, like barely 20, when Jay-Z's label, Rockefeller Records, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe they reached out to her and wanted to sign her, and she was flown out to meet Jay-Z. So you hear these stories of this kind of mentor-mentee relationship in the music industry, and I think Mac Miller and Role Model is a really, really interesting one. I just think it's one not many people know about. Not many people know about Mac Miller's influence on Role Model. So if Role Model was looking for a sign from the universe to keep pursuing music, he well and truly got it. Yeah, Mac Miller and his team flew him out to LA so they could make music together and just ultimately hang out. An incredible and timely opportunity, considering Mac Miller tragically died just a year later. But as short-lived as their time together may have been, the impact and influence of the rapper is something Role Model's kept with him to this day, and I reckon it's something he'll take with him through the rest of his life. With every lyric he writes and every song he produces, the first thought Tucker has is, would Malcolm like this? Would Malcolm listen to this? And I think that really acts as a microcosm for the impression Mac Miller's left on the artists that were lucky enough to cross into his circle and be in his orbit. I don't know much about him, but just what I've heard about through interviews, his just brilliance and talent and kindness had such a lasting impact on everyone he ever met. But anyway, if you're wondering what happened from that point onwards, what happened after Mac Miller got in touch with Role Model, well, Role Model enters the Benny camp, the acclaimed Benny camp I mentioned in the intro. I presume Mac Miller put him in touch with Benny Blanco, considering they'd worked together before. At the time, Benny Blanco had his own record label, Mad Love Records, which was a branch of the very famous and very acclaimed Interscope Records, the same one that Billy and I don't know if Gracie actually, but I'm pretty sure Billy also signed to. Tucker signed to Mad Love in 2018, but it's clear that things weren't as smooth sailing as they sounded. In an interview for GQ in 2022, Role Model spoke about his time with Mad Love, saying, Benny Blanco didn't know how to run a label, so that obviously fell apart, and he dropped everyone. Luckily, Interscope came to my rescue, and I've been with them ever since. I mean, for context, Mad Love has gone defunct as of 2024, so there's no exaggeration from Role Model here about Benny not being able to clearly run a label, but arguably Benny is the reason why he got signed to Interscope in the first place. So, you've got to give credit where credit is due. Anyway, in 2018, Role Model signs to Interscope and releases a string of singles. In 2019, he features on Julia Michaels' EP In a Monologue Part 2, the first part of the EP featuring the likes of Selena Gomez and Niall Horan. And later that year, Tucker went on to release his debut EP, Oh How Perfect, as well as going on his first tour. That's a lot. So I guess here you can really see like the influence a label has on an artist. Like his career completely took off. He went from a student at uni, making music in his dorm because he had 2 broken wrists, to all of a sudden featuring on EPs of incredibly talented artists, putting out his own music, going on tour. It's, the opportunities that come with a label is ridiculous. But as you can see, I would say this part of his career was more so like the hustling stage for him. This is when it's kind of that crucial moment of the label and himself seeing, does he have what it takes to be a musician? Will he actually be successful, or do you give it 5 years and call it a day? His EP featured New Zealand artist Benny, who shot to fame in lockdown with her song Super Lonely. Now, guys, genuinely, if you don't know the name Benny, if you don't know the title track Super Lonely, fear not, because you will recognize it when you play it. I was the same. I know Benny, but I didn't know the track Super Lonely. I was kind of like, oh, what is this song? Like, people, I was reading about it and I was like, the biggest lockdown tune, and I was like, what? Never heard of it. Play Super Lonely. Guys, pause this. Pause this podcast if you may, if you must, and play Super Lonely right now. It will take you straight back to lockdown. I literally felt so nostalgic listening to this song. It's a complete pandemic classic, but a point that's super gripping here is that Julia Michaels, who I just mentioned that Role Model collaborated with, also launched into mainstream success during the pandemic with her and JP Sax's song If the World Was Ending. So it turns out that Role Model was kind of in the background of a lot of the huge pandemic tracks and artists, and perhaps this is how his name first started to crop up for industry professionals. People hadn't really heard of Role Model, and then he features on Julia Michaels' EP. He does a collab with Benny, two artists that shoot to fame and success. People are going to start turning their heads and noticing him. Not only did he have the backing of a major label and a major musician, but he also, as I just said, featured in the discographies of notable breakthrough artists that soundtracked our lockdown in 2020. However, and yes, there's a however, it was also these very opportunities that resulted in Role Model feeling a bit sonically lost, or perhaps resulted in him getting his first taste of doubt and imposter syndrome. As I mentioned, Role Model began making music on his own, by himself, in his dorm room at uni. The music making process for him was all very insular and very, very independent. It was all just him. And of course, with that comes a lack of outside opinion. It was Role Model making what Role Model wanted to make. But when he signed to Interscope, he also signed up for access to studios and industry professionals. He signed up to producers and engineers and songwriters, maybe even session musicians. Truly, the list goes on and on. And what did all those people bring? Their opinions. And this process is one that tons of musicians go through. Again, one I have off the top of my head is Tate McRae. She spoke about this in an interview with Zane Lowe, but when she first joined her label, RCA Records, she ended up losing a lot of her vision and a lot of her sound, I guess, because she was so influenced by all these other artists she was working with. What happens is that these new and breakthrough artists are put in a room with professionals who've most likely worked with their idols. And so the natural response is to be like, oh wait, maybe I should listen to them because they produced for Ariana, or they produced for Billie, or they produced for Future, or they produced for Maggie Rogers. You know, you're going to be put with producers and songwriters that have never inevitably worked with someone you adore. So of course you're going to doubt yourself. Of course you're going to doubt your abilities because you're a student in that situation. Although labels bring names and money and support, there's also this power dynamic or hierarchy that takes place when artists sign. They're sort of put through this speed dating process of working with writers and producers, as I just explained, which of course then leads to a loss of tunnel vision on what an artist wants or what they want to sound like. So this is what happened to Role Model. His 2019 EP, Oh How Perfect, was produced and written by a variety of big industry names, such as Alexander Glantz, also known as Alexander 23, who has worked with the likes of René Rapp and many, many others. Benjamin Miller, who's worked with the likes of Julia Michaels, and Andrew Wells, who's worked with none other than Chappell Roan. And these are just a few, okay? But the insecurity and lack of self-confidence Role Model had wasn't born directly out of Interscope. It also came from his relationship to the internet sensation, Emma Chamberlain. Emma and Role Model started dating in 2020, their paths crossing in 2018 being one of impeccable timing. Role Model moved to LA for his music the same year Emma moved to LA to further her YouTube career, 2018. So it wasn't long before Tucker slid into Emma's DMs and ended up entering what would become a 3-year relationship with her. But as you'd expect, entering a relationship with one of the most famous content creators on the internet came with its challenges. After their soft launch in 2022, where Emma featured in one of Role Model's music videos, it became an increasing fear for Tucker that people would turn up to his shows purely because he was Emma's boyfriend, that he wouldn't actually be known or liked for his music or have any fans because he was simply just the boyfriend of Emma Chamberlain instead. Also, something I wanted to quickly add in here is around this time he also auditioned to play Elliot in HBO Max's Euphoria, which is famously played by Dominic Fike. I thought that was a very, very interesting piece of information that would just be doing you an injustice if I didn't tell you about. But back to what I was saying. Whilst Role Model did see a significant increase in attention and fans after his relationship to Emma became publicised, He was right in having that caution and fear, because with the release of his 2022 debut album RX, the music was largely overshadowed by fans picking apart what songs were about Emma and what information on their relationship they could extract from them. There was also this underlying worry for Role Model that if he fell in love and was happy, would people still like his music, because he built his brand and his fan base off of his honesty and off of him sharing his struggles in life. You know, again, like a similar issue loads of artists have. I mean, I think there's a pretty like iconic interview with Taylor Swift where an interviewer jokes to her like, "Oh, what's going to happen when you're happy?" Do you know what I mean? Or like something like that, like what are you going to write about when you're finally happy or something? And Taylor's like, "It's genuinely a fear." She's like, "It's genuinely a fear that when I'm happy, I'll have nothing to write about." But ultimately, one of the issues he did write about on the album was this yearning for his home, was his homesickness. And it was this homesickness that eventually became the very thing that broke that happiness down for Role Model and became the very thing that ended his relationship with Emma. Ever since moving to LA, Role Model really struggled with making friends and adjusting to the city life in comparison to the small and scenic childhood he had in Maine. He had what he describes as a quarter-life crisis, where he had no motivation or creativity to make music. He was miserable in LA and would only feel recentered and at peace when he went and visited his family back in Maine. So we see where this is going. We see how this is going to end. LA equals Emma. When he was with Emma, he was simultaneously in the environment that made him so depressed and so miserable. And so it was inevitable that their relationship fell apart. But this 2023 crisis, mixed with the guitar skills Emma's dad taught him, manifested itself into making what would become Role Model's breakthrough album, Kansas Anymore. The title is a nod to the 1939 movie The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy says to her dog, "Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." It's a phrase that's come to be used as a way of saying you've entered an unfamiliar or uncomfortable place. Basically, it touches on the feeling of being lost. So it's a rather fitting title, considering the homesickness Tucker was absolutely riddled with. The album dropped in July of 2024 and really catapulted him into fame. Look at That Woman, a single from the album, blew up on TikTok, grabbing the attention of a whole new set of fans. But it was also his new sound and his improved confidence that I think had a massive part to play in his success. You know, on this album, Role Model sort of followed where the music scene was going in that year. He leaned into a more pop and Americana influence, which mirrored the rise of country and pop that took place last year. But he also worked with a new team of people. He collaborated mainly and solely with Noah Conrad, the producer who's worked with Ash, Chappell Roan, and Holly Humstone, a huge name in the industry. So that's where the pop influence comes into it. And he also worked with, oh my God, guys, I cannot tell you how happy this made me. Turns out he also worked with Ian Fitchuk, who's produced for Maggie Rogers and Casey Musgraves. In other words, Ian Fitchuk brought in the Americana country influence. I love Ian Fitchuk's production. I think he's phenomenal. And I had no idea he worked and collaborated with Role Model on this album. And it just makes so much sense that he did. Genuinely, when you start to notice the producers behind some of your favourite albums, you start to see a pattern of the same producers producing your same favourite songs or your same favourite albums. Some people prefer producers producing styles than others. You know, like for me, Jack Antonoff, I'm not the biggest fan of his production style. Aaron Dessner, on the other hand, I adore. Ian Fitchuk, I adore. Noah Conrad, adore. And Phineas, adore. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent, but when you start to actually get in the song credits of albums, it does actually tell you a lot about why you might like an album. So anyway, as if that wasn't enough to grab the attention of a whole new set of fans, of a large pool of fans, one of his tracks, Francis, who most people immediately knew was going to be about Emma, was also produced and co-written by the 1975 bassist Ross MacDonald. So I mean, it's no wonder that this album found its fans. For once, Role Model had the reassurance that his music was gaining attraction because it was connecting with people, not because the internet was trying to dissect his relationship. And so you see Role Model take on this whole new confidence, to be honest. Although the album did ultimately track the breakdown and breakup of his relationship with Emma, it was his self-deprecation and honesty that made people see Role Model in a favourable light. He was just about to embark on an EU tour when he got a call from Gracie Abrams to open for the Secret of Us tour, exposing him to thousands of more heartbroken and yearnful fans. In the same month, he was also nominated for Sexiest Musician, losing out to Harry Styles. But the TikTok campaign he made for it was again what attracted a lot of attention and a lot of love online. With Gracie Abrams blowing up on TikTok with the belter That's So True, and Role Model first coming to people's attention through Look at That Woman, Role Model's been very, very clever at curating a fan base on TikTok. He has a separate account called Saint Laurent Cowboy where he plays Role Model's evil twin. So with their internet beef and his campaign to win Sexiest Musician, Role Model's done a pretty phenomenal job at creating a very, very tight-knit relationship with his fans. He's managed to create inside jokes with them to such an extent where anyone who sees one of his TikToks will have a very hard time, number one, just understanding its content, but number two, trying to understand its comment section. As an outsider, I'm truly so lost. And like one of my friends was trying to explain the fandom to me, and she was like, I actually just don't know how to make this make sense for you. She was like, you just kind of have to be there to get it. So is this really selective thing where you kind of have to know, there's like lore behind being a fan of Role Model. He kicked off his tour promoting Kansas Anymore in November and released the deluxe in February, producing another hit song where special guests are brought out each night to be his Sally. Guys, it's really got to that point where if you know, you know. And this is what I mean. It's so hard to just casually be a Role Model fan. I absolutely adored the album from him. I thought it was phenomenal. Again, I only listened to it because he was Emma's boyfriend and I hadn't listened to his music before, but I obviously knew about their relationship. And I was really pleasantly surprised. I thought this is a fantastic album and just straight up my street. But when I look at his TikToks or things his fans are saying, I just get so lost. You truly have to keep up with Role Model to be a part of his fan base. There's no such thing as outsiders. It just doesn't work. And I guess that brings me to the end of this episode. That's really Role Model's life in a nutshell. From a name filled with irony and self-depreciation as Tucker Pillsbury mocked his depressive and unstructured lifestyle, to connecting with thousands of fans through his mature and transparent lyrics, Role Model has indeed fulfilled the literal interpretation of his name. Whilst he's felt doubt in what musical direction to take and has had concerns over if he could create a name for himself on his own, it's safe to say that Role Model is neither lost nor in Kansas anymore. Instead, he's exactly where he wants to be, churning out music that fans excitedly scream back at him, while simultaneously never letting go of the guidance and confidence the late and great Mac Miller poured into him from the start of his career. Thank you all so much for listening. If you want to keep up to date with all things 6 Notes of Separation, make sure to follow us on TikTok at 6 Notes Podcast. We're also around on Instagram too if you want to check that out. Same tag, 6 Notes Podcast. And I'll be back very, very shortly with another episode on another artist where we'll be exploring the link between them and Role Model.